During the Second World War, a host of things that were part of ordinary everyday life suddenly came to a halt. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that football was one of those things. But remarkably, as the fighting waged, football mostly found a way to carry on. As the war began, countries initially reacted very differently. Aware of the criticism it had received in the First World War for carrying on for a season, the Football League abandoned the 1939-40 season on the 3rd of September 1939, the very day that war was declared. The season was just 3 games old and the table was topped by Blackpool. Yet just a few weeks later, it was back. You see, it was quickly recognised how important sport was for morale. Regional leagues were established before the end of October, and as regulations on public gatherings were loosened, 42,300 people turned up at Wembley the following June to watch the first War Cup final in which West Ham beat Blackburn 1-0. An air raid could have been catastrophic, but the risk was deemed worth it. Regional competitions, often with guest players as footballers, moved around the country with their army units and continued throughout the war. Amidst all the chaos, football allowed an illusion of normality. France declared a national champion every year, even though football was impossible in certain areas in 1939-40 because of the German invasion, and then in 44-45 and 45-46 after D-Day. The Netherlands missed only 1 season and Italy missed just 2. The German authorities, broadly speaking, encouraged football in countries that they had occupied precisely to give a sense of life going on. That led, famously in Kiev, to the death match, as a team of former Dynamo players were arrested and interned after beating a Luftwaffe side. They were probably detained because Dynamo were funded by the Soviet secret police rather than because of the result, but either way, 1 player died under torture and 3 others were shot in reprisals for an attack on a factory that repaired motorized sleds. Hungary suffered 2 invasions, one by the Germans and one by the Soviets, but football never stopped. On the 6th of December 1944, with Nazi-occupied Budapest under bombardment from the Red Army, the Újpest coach, Géza Kertész, who was working with a resistance group that had been supplying details on troop movements to the US, took a training session, then held a press conference previewing the upcoming derby against Ferencváros. That evening, he was arrested by local fascists and handed over to the Gestapo. He was executed 2 months later as the Germans retreated. The Austrian League was deprofessionalized in 1938 following the Anschluss, because of the Nazi belief that being paid for playing sport was in some way a Jewish perversion. In Germany, though, football continued even as the Allied invasion began. The Bavarian Championship was the last to be abandoned, going on until March 1945. The table was led by Bayern Munich, whose manager, the great former Hungarian striker Alfred Schäfer, was found dead in a railway carriage a few weeks later, probably of a stroke, although the US authorities didn't bother with an autopsy. Football came to a halt in occupied Germany as institutions were denazified. It started up first in the US zone as the Americans began to prioritize normalization and getting society moving again over the pursuit of former Nazis. The first post-war German champions were Nuremberg, who beat Kaiserslautern in the 1948 final. English football began to return to normal in the 1945-46 season. Although there was no league, and to offer some compensation for a lack of fixtures, the FA Cup became 2-legged until the final, in which Derby beat Charlton. Only in 46-47 did the league resume, with Liverpool lifting the title, in part because they'd built themselves up on a pre-season tour of the USA, where there was none of the rationing that restricted the diets at home. Now, the resumption of the World Cup in 1950 came as confirmation that order had been restored. Brazil, having barely been involved in the Second World War, was selected as host. But the World Cup's trophy survival was not without its own jeopardy. After Italy had won the World Cup in 1938, Ottorino Barassi, an official at the Italian Football Federation, took charge of the Jules Rimet trophy, locking it in a security box in a bank in Milan. As Mussolini fell and the Germans invaded northern Italy in 1943, Barassi went back to the bank, smuggled out the trophy, and hid it in a shoebox under his bed. Barassi's house was searched by the Nazis, but remarkably, the shoebox went undiscovered. By 1950, he was the president of the Italian Football Federation, so having protected the trophy throughout the war, he was able to hand it over to be presented to the victorious Uruguayans. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Daniel Taylor, Ollie Kay, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insight on every Premier League football story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football.